I held the small wrapped box in my hands and felt every eye in that banquet hall shift toward me. Inside, when I finally opened it, was a single fishing lure, $3.50. Still had the sticker from the bait shop on it. Across the room, my wife was fastening a diamond tennis bracelet around another man's wrist, a bracelet that cost more than my truck. The room had gone quiet the way rooms do when everyone senses they're watching something they'll talk about for years. She looked at me and smiled, the kind of smile that isn't for you, it's for everyone watching you. I know it's not much, she said, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear, but I figured you'd rather be out on that lake than anywhere near me these days. Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old, and by the time the sun came up the next morning, I was 300 miles away, and I had left something behind in that house that would take my wife exactly 11 days to find, and when she found it, her whole world came apart at the seams. Stay with me, son, because what happened after that morning, she never once saw coming. But before I tell you what I left behind, you need to understand who Diane was before she became the woman standing at that podium with another man's hand at the small of her back. Because there was a time, a long time, when none of this would have seemed possible. Not from her, not from us. I met Diane Petrov in the spring of 1988 at a hardware store in Lubbock, Texas, where I was working the counter to pay my way through a community college electrician's program. She came in looking for a part for a broken porch light, described it so precisely, down to the thread pitch, that I figured she had to be an engineer's daughter, and she was. Smartest woman I ever met, still might be. She had this way of walking into a problem sideways, looking at it from an angle nobody else thought to try, and just solving it. I used to tell people I didn't fall in love with her face, though God knows I did. I fell in love with the way her mind worked. 36 years is a long time to watch somebody's mind work. We built a life the way people used to build things, slow, with our hands, one paycheck at a time. I got my electrician's license and started my own contracting business, Higgins Electric, out of the back of a Ford pickup with a magnetic sign on the door. Diane went back to school in her 30s, got her real estate license, and by the time she was 50, she owned the largest independent brokerage in 3 counties, Petrov Realty Group, 31 agents under her, a glass-fronted office downtown with her name etched into the door in gold letters. I watched every bit of that climb from close range. I rewired that office myself, twice, as she expanded it. I sat through Sunday dinners where she talked contracts and commission splits, and I nodded and asked the right questions because I wanted to understand her world, even after mine had gotten smaller and quieter and further from the center of things. I drove her to closings when her car was in the shop. I learned to make her coffee exactly how she liked it, and I made it every single morning for 30 years, even the mornings when she barely looked up from her phone to say thank you. I did every bit of that willingly. I need you to understand that. Nobody made me build a life around loving that woman. I chose it every day for a long time. The trouble, if I'm honest with myself, and I've had a lot of quiet nights lately to be honest with myself, started about 2 years ago. Small things first. She started dressing different for the office, not for me, for the office. New perfume that showed up in the bathroom cabinet without a word about where it came from. She'd laugh at her phone in a way she used to laugh at things I said, except now the phone was getting the laugh and I was getting the silence. I told myself it was stress. Business was booming, she'd say. Biggest year the brokerage ever had. And booming businesses eat people alive from the inside sometimes, even good people. I told myself a lot of things, and I believed most of them, because believing them was easier than the alternative. His name was Derek Sabin, 31 years old. She'd hired him 18 months back as her top producing agent, and there was something about the way that man carried himself through a room, like he owned whatever air he was breathing, that made grown men 15 years his senior go quiet when he walked past. He drove a car he couldn't afford on a salesman's draw, wore suits that fit too well for somebody just starting out, and called Diane boss in a tone that didn't sound like respect so much as ownership, I noticed. I noticed the way she'd angle her whole body toward him at the office Christmas party the year before. I noticed and I filed it away, under things I didn't want to look at directly, the way you don't stare at the sun even when you know exactly where it is in the sky. The banquet that night was the Realtor Association's annual awards dinner, held at the Cattleman's Hall out on Route 9, The kind of event where the whole county's real estate business gets dressed up in tuxedos and gowns to hand each other plaques. Diane had won Broker of the Year, again her fourth time, and she'd asked me weeks in advance to be there. Told me it mattered to her that I sit at the head table. I had bought a new sport coat for the occasion, navy blue. She used to like me in navy blue. I should have known something was wrong when she told me, 3 days before, that they'd added a team recognition segment to the evening, gifts between colleagues, a tradition she said had started at some conference in Dallas. I didn't think much of it. I wrapped up a little something for her too, a first edition print of the old county courthouse, the building we'd gotten married in front of. In a hand-carved oak frame I'd made myself in my shop over 3 weekends. I was proud of that frame. I'd sanded it smooth as glass. She never got around to opening it. The team recognition segment started around 9 o'clock, after the main awards, after the wine had loosened up the room. Diane stood at the podium with a small velvet box, and I remember thinking, sitting there in my navy sport coat, that she looked more alive up on that stage than I'd seen her look at our own dinner table in longer than I wanted to count. "This next award isn't official," she said into the microphone, smiling out at the crowd, "but it should be. For the agent who's given this brokerage everything, who's made me believe in what we're building here again." She looked directly at Derek Saban's table. "Derek, come on up here." He walked up like he'd rehearsed it, hands in his pockets, easy smile, the kind of confidence that only comes from already knowing how a scene is going to end. She opened the velvet box herself and fastened the tennis bracelet around his wrist with her own 2 hands, right there in front of 300 people, her fingers lingering at his cuff, a half-second longer than any business relationship required. Someone near the bar murmured the price out loud, $11,000, loud enough that half the room heard it and went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everybody's doing math they don't want to be doing. Then she turned, and her eyes found me at the head table, and she smiled that public smile, and she said, "Walter, honey, don't think I forgot about you." And she reached under the table and pulled out a small paper gift bag, the cheap kind you get at a drugstore checkout, and she held it out and waited for me to come get it, because apparently I was supposed to walk up in front of everyone the way Derek just had. So I did. I stood up. I buttoned my navy sport coat, and I walked the length of that hall in dress shoes that suddenly felt too tight, past tables of people I'd known for 20 years, past the Hendersons whose deck I'd wired myself, past Pastor Cole who'd married us in 1989, and I took that bag out of my wife's hand. Inside was a fishing lure, $3.50. The sticker from Cabela's still stuck to the packaging. "I know it's not much," she said, and her voice carried, because she made sure it carried, "but I figured you'd rather be out on that lake than anywhere near me these days." There was laughter. Not everybody, but enough that I heard it clear as a bell, and I will hear it for the rest of my natural life. I looked at her face, right there under those hall lights, looking for something, anger maybe, or shame, something human I could work with. What I found instead was worse than either of those things. It was satisfaction. Plain and simple satisfaction. The look of a woman who had planned this moment down to the minute and was pleased with how it landed. "Thank you, Diane," I said. "That's real thoughtful." I smiled. I sat back down at that head table with a fishing lure in my hand, and I finished my coffee like a man who hadn't just had his marriage buried in front of the whole county. And I want to tell you, son, that smile cost me something I don't think I'll ever fully get back. But I want to tell you something else, too. Underneath the smile, for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't confused anymore. I was clear. Clearer than I'd been since this whole slow unraveling started. If you've ever sat in a room and had someone look right through you like you were furniture that used to matter, you already understand something that doesn't translate into words easy. Anger, at least, means somebody's still seeing you as a threat worth the energy. What Diane gave me that night wasn't anger. It was the look you give an old truck you're finally ready to trade in. And I have built things with my hands my whole life. Wiring, framing, whole houses from the studs up, and nothing I ever built prepared me for how much it costs a man to sit still through that particular silence. The drive home was 45 minutes and neither one of us said a single word. Diane stared out the passenger window at the dark fields going by, composing her face back into something she could wear into the house. I drove, and I thought about the daughter we lost in her second trimester back in 2003, and how Diane hadn't spoken about it since. Not once, not even the anniversary. I thought about the year I put my own contracting business on part-time hours, so I could handle the books for her brokerage while she was building it up, 3 years of my own trade slowing down so hers could take off. I thought about the garden shed I built her, the one with the reading nook overlooking the back pasture, that she'd walked into maybe 4 times in 6 years. I thought about a lot of things on that drive, and none of them added up to a woman who hands her husband a fishing lure in front of 300 people and calls it a joke. We got home a little after 11. Diane went straight to her office to make some calls, she said, closing paperwork that couldn't wait, and I went up to bed alone, the way I'd been going to bed alone more nights than not for longer than I'd let myself admit. Around 1 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, face down, which she never used to do. She'd always kept it face up, told me for 30 years it was in case one of the kids ever needed her in the middle of the night. Tonight, face down. It buzzed again, then a third time. I reached over and turned it face up. Derek, tonight was perfect. She looked at me like I was the only person in that whole room. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending in front of him. Pretending in front of him. I read it twice, then a third time, and I set the phone back down exactly the way I'd found it. I want to tell you what I felt lying there, because I think it matters, and because I think some of you watching this know exactly what I'm about to describe. I did not feel rage. Rage would have been easier, honestly. Rage burns hot and it burns out. What I felt was grief, slow and total, the kind that doesn't announce itself with shouting. It just settles into your chest like weather moving in, and you understand somewhere underneath the pain that this is simply what's true now, and there's no version of tonight where it isn't true anymore. I lay there next to my wife of 36 years and stared at a ceiling I'd painted myself 2 summers back, and one by one I ran through every excuse I'd made for her over the last 2 years. The late nights, the new perfume, the way she'd stopped reaching for my hand in the truck. They all ran out at the same time, like a drawer finally hitting bottom. I got up sometime after 2. I didn't turn on the hallway light. I knew that house well enough to walk it blind. I made a pot of coffee in the dark kitchen, and I stood at the counter and let myself finally understand, fully and without any more excuses, what some part of me had already known for the better part of a year. By 2:30, I was down in my workshop, the converted garage bay Diane called Walter's man cave, with a kind of gentle condescension she reserved for anything that wasn't her business. That condescension, it turns out, had been doing me a favor all along, because she had never once come out there and looked closely at what I kept in the tall metal cabinet against the back wall. Behind the tax files and the old photo albums from before the kids left home, there was a fireproof lockbox I'd been quietly filling for the better part of a year. Not because I'd caught her at anything specific early on, but because I'm a methodical man, always have been. You don't wire a house without checking every connection twice. And some part of me had been checking connections in my marriage long before I was ready to say so out loud. Inside that lockbox were bank statements showing cash withdrawals from our joint savings, $4,000 and $5,000 at a time, going back 11 months. Credit card charges from a boutique hotel out on the interstate, the Cimarron Inn, same room number, 6 separate stays over 8 months, every single one falling on a night Diane had told me she was in Amarillo for a closing. There were charges from a jewelry store in the city I didn't recognize, a receipt for a men's watch that never appeared in our house, never once got mentioned. I had explained every one of these away to myself over the months: business expenses, client entertainment, the ordinary financial noise of running a growing brokerage. Sitting there at 2:30 in the morning with all of it laid out on my workbench under a single shop light, there was no explaining it away anymore. She had been funding an affair with money we'd built together over 3 decades, and the man wearing the proof of it on his wrist had just had it fastened there by her own hands in front of the whole county. I photographed every page, careful and slow, the way I do everything, and I put it all back exactly where I'd found it, because I wasn't finished yet, and I needed her to have no idea I ever knew. Then I pulled out a legal pad, the yellow kind I use for job estimates, and I wrote for the better part of an hour. Not a cruel letter. I want to be clear about that, because I thought a long time about what kind of man I wanted to be on my way out that door, and cruelty wasn't it. I wrote her the truth, plain and complete, the way I'd want somebody to write it to me. By 5 in the morning my truck was loaded. I took my father's old level, the one he gave me when I started the business, my important papers, the folder from the lockbox, and a duffel bag of clothes. I left behind the recliner she bought me for my 60th that I never once sat in because it faced away from the fireplace, the truck she'd talked me into trading up for 2 years back that I never really wanted, every gift that had ever come with an unspoken price attached to it. I left behind, if I'm honest, a version of myself that had gotten real good at making himself smaller so there'd be more room for her. I set the folder, printed copies of every statement and every receipt, along with the letter, on the kitchen table where she'd find it with her morning coffee, and I walked out to my truck in that cold Texas dark, and I drove north. The letter told her everything, that I knew about Derek, that I knew about the Cimarron Inn 6 times over 8 months, that I knew about the watch, that I'd already met twice with an attorney over in Amarillo, a woman named Rosalind Ferris who came recommended by a client whose deck I'd built, and that the paperwork was already in motion, that there was an account she'd never known existed, built quietly over 4 years from side jobs and overtime work I never told her about, holding $168,000, money that was mine alone under Texas law, because it had never once touched our joint accounts. That the refinancing on the workshop and the 5 acres behind the house, which I'd handled myself 8 months back while she was traveling for a conference, included language that made that parcel and everything on it separate property, mine outright, and that she'd signed off on it without reading past the signature line because she trusted me to handle the boring parts the way she always had. Was that fair of me, structuring things quiet like that before I even had proof? I've turned that question over more nights than I can count, and here's where I've landed. I learned a long time ago, watching my own father get taken apart slow by a woman who never once raised her voice at him, that being steady and being trusting aren't the same thing as being protected. Somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, I'd stopped being unprotected. The letter ended with this. You spent the last 2 years deciding I didn't matter enough to be honest with. I spent that same 2 years quietly making sure that when this day came, I wouldn't be the one left holding nothing. I hope somewhere down the road you understand I saw more than you ever gave me credit for. I signed it, Walter. Then I drove. I want to be honest with you about those first hours on the highway, because I think there's something in it worth saying out loud. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt free, that part's true, but underneath the free there was an ache that went all the way down, because what I was driving away from wasn't a bad 36 years. It was the belief that those 36 years had been what I thought they were. The woman who used to save me the last piece of pie without being asked, who used to fall asleep with her hand flat on my chest, that woman had been real once, and somewhere around the Oklahoma line, with the sun coming up gray and cold over the wheat fields, I let myself grieve her properly for the first time. I turned my phone back on around 8, after stopping for gas outside a little town called Sayre. 26 missed calls, 41 texts. I read through them sitting in that gas station parking lot, and the pattern of them was almost clinical, like watching a fever break, denial first, then bargaining, then somewhere around message 19, something that read like real fear for the first time. 7:40 a.m. Walter, this isn't funny. Where are you? 8:15 a.m. I called the bank. There's an account I've never seen. What is this? Call me right now. 9:02 a.m. Something's wrong at the office. I can't reach Derek. Please just call me back. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and drank my coffee slow. I want to pause right here, son, and be straight with you, because this is the part where folks always ask me the same question. Was what I did next cruel? I've sat with that question for the better part of 6 months now, turning it over the way you'd turn over a piece of wood looking for the grain, and here's the honest answer I've come to. I made one phone call. I sent one set of photographs, and everything that happened after that, I didn't build it. I just made sure the truth found the people it belonged to. The photographs showed Diane and Derek walking into the Cimarron Inn together, time-stamped 6 different nights. I sent them, not to Diane, but to a woman named Sherry Sabin, Derek's wife, a school teacher over in the next county, married 5 years, 2 little boys. Sherry called me the next afternoon. Her voice was steady in a way I hadn't expected, careful, and even like a woman reading off a checklist she'd already made peace with. Mr. Higgins, she said, I think we ought to sit down somewhere. I met her at a diner off the highway, expecting somebody blindsided and shaking. What I found instead was a woman who reminded me, in a way that hit me harder than I let on, of myself 6 months from now, the stillness of somebody who's already made her decision and is just working through the logistics of it. She had a folder of her own laid out on the table before I even sat down. Tell me everything you know, she said. No crying, no preamble. What she showed me changed the shape of the whole story I thought I'd been living. Derek had been running personal expenses, the hotel, dinners, a leased car upgrade, through the brokerage's corporate account, expressly against company policy, going back the better part of a year. Just over $12,000 total. Close enough to the price of that bracelet that it made my stomach turn. Sherry had already filed for divorce that same morning. Derek would be served papers at the brokerage's Monday sales meeting, in front of the whole office, Diane included. She'll cut him loose the second this touches her reputation, I told Sherry. That's how she operates. I've watched her do it to other people for 30 years. Sherry looked at me across that diner table without blinking once. That, she said, is exactly what I'm counting on. The papers were served at 9:15 Monday morning. The corporate expense report hit the brokerage's compliance officer's desk the same hour. Derek walked into that sales meeting and walked out, unemployed, served, and exposed in front of every agent who'd watched Diane fasten that $11,000 bracelet onto his wrist 5 days earlier. Diane did precisely what I told Sherry she'd do. She stood up in that meeting and expressed her deep concern for Derek's personal troubles. She offered to cover his listings while he, quote, sorted out his family situation. Composed. Professional. Ice cold. But holding that story together meant denying she'd known anything about the expense charges, which meant denying she'd authorized any of them. And when the compliance investigation widened out and found her email approvals buried 3 folders deep, the brokerage's ownership group started asking her questions she had no clean way to answer. 4 weeks after that banquet dinner, Diane Petrov was asked to step down from the company that had her name on the front door in gold letters. They handed her a severance check and a stack of documents to sign. She signed every one of them. 22 years of building that brokerage, gone in an afternoon. I didn't hear it from Diane. I heard it from Sherry, who'd taken to texting me every so often just to check in. 2 people who'd landed in the same wreckage from different directions. When her message came through, short, matter of fact, I sat with my phone in my hand out on the dock behind the little cabin I'd rented on Lake Meredith, and I waited to feel triumphant. What I felt instead was a heaviness that surprised me. Sad, for what that marriage had once genuinely been, for the woman in the shoebox of old anniversary cards who had somehow, slow as erosion, turned into somebody I didn't recognize anymore, and neither one of us had noticed it happening in time to stop it. Derek was charged with misappropriation of funds 3 months later. He pled down to 18 months of probation and full restitution. Sherry's family home, inherited from her grandmother years before the marriage, was protected clean under Texas separate property law. He left that marriage with a suitcase and half of a debt that had mostly paid for hotel rooms and dinners he couldn't afford on his own. I was out on the dock repairing a section of railing on a Thursday afternoon, 5 months after I'd left, when I heard tires on the gravel drive, Diane's car. She got out slow, wearing jeans I didn't recognize, flat shoes, her hair down instead of pinned up the way she wore it for the office. She looked like a woman still learning how to stand up straight without the scaffolding she'd spent her whole adult life building around herself. She stopped at the edge of the dock. "Hello, Walter. How'd you find this place? Rosalind mentioned you might be willing to talk, if I asked right." I set my hammer down. I nodded toward the 2 folding chairs at the end of the dock, and she sat in the one that had always been mine, careful, like she knew she wasn't entitled to it anymore and was sitting there anyway. She told me about the investigation, about the ownership meeting where they slid the severance agreement and a pen across the table to her, about how she'd told the compliance officer she had no knowledge of Derek's charges, positioned herself as another person he'd deceived. I looked at her straight on. Was that true? A long silence. The water moved against the dock pilings. "No," she said finally. "I knew about most of it. I approved some of it myself. And when it all came apart, I protected myself, because I didn't know any other way to survive what I'd done." She looked down at her hands in her lap. "I let him take the whole fall. And then I sat in my car in that parking garage for over an hour afterward, because I couldn't decide which part of myself I hated worse." Quiet stretched out between us a long while. A heron worked the shallows down the shoreline. The wind moved through the cottonwoods behind the cabin. "Why, Diane?" I asked her. And I want you to know there wasn't any accusation left in me by then, just a real need to finally understand. Why wasn't what we had enough for you? She sat with that a long time before she answered. "Because I stopped seeing you," she said. "Not stopped loving you, exactly. Stopped seeing you. You were so steady, Walter, so capable. You never once fell apart on me, not even after we lost the baby, not even when your own business slowed down so mine could grow. And somewhere in there I just started assuming you were fine, always. because you never once told me otherwise. You never asked for anything back." Her voice went flat and quiet. And Derek needed things from me constantly. My time, my name, my contacts. And it felt like being needed. And I confused that feeling with being loved because it had been so long since I remembered what being loved actually felt like. "You confused being wanted with being loved," I said. "Yes," barely a whisper. "That's exactly what I did." We sat with the water a while longer, not talking. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't offer her comfort. I didn't have to give. But I also didn't perform my hurt for her benefit, and I think she understood both of those things without me needing to say them. "The brokerage listing on the house didn't sell," she said eventually. "I'm 3 payments behind on the mortgage now. I've got the severance, but it won't stretch far with legal fees on top of it. I'm going to have to start over from somewhere close to zero." She looked at me then, with something unguarded in her face. Something I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. "What about you? What will you do?" "Don't know exactly," I told her. "Something quieter, something honest. I've got the acreage, the workshop. Might take on some electrical contracts again, teach a young fellow the trade, if the right one comes along. I've got time to figure it out." She stood up slow, smoothing her jeans down with both hands. "I'm not going to contest the divorce, Walter. Whatever you need for the settlement, I won't fight you on it." "I don't want anything from you," I said. "I just want it finished, clean." She nodded at that. And then, right there at the end of my dock, something in her composure that she'd spent 5 months rebuilding just gave way all at once. Her face opened up into something raw and unguarded and so tired. "You deserved somebody who kept looking at you," she said. "I stopped looking, and I am sorrier than I know how to put into words, Walter. I really am." After her car pulled back out onto the county road, I sat out on that dock a long while and watched the light shift over the water the way it does out here in the evenings. Gold, going to gray, going to that deep blue. That means the day's finally done with you. Here's what I want to leave you with, and I want you to hear it clean. I did not feel like I'd won anything. What I felt was quieter than that, and it's lasted longer. I felt finished. The grief that had been sitting in my chest since that banquet hall finally finished doing whatever work grief does when you let it run its full course instead of stuffing it down. It cleared the ground out, is the only way I know how to put it. The mistake most of us make, and I made it for 2 solid years before I woke up to it, is waiting around for somebody to finally notice us. You cannot wait on that, not if you want to keep any real respect for yourself while you wait. Respect doesn't get withheld from you by accident, and then handed back later because you stuck around being patient about it. Once somebody's decided in their own mind that you don't require their attention anymore, the only thing left worth doing is removing yourself from that math entirely and letting them work out on their own what they're left holding. What this whole thing taught me, slow, over 5 months of coffee on a dock and long walks around this lake in evenings, sitting with nothing but the sound of water against the pilings, is that starting over at 63 isn't a defeat. It's a life that was waiting on you the whole time, finally catching up, once you stop spending yourself down to nothing propping up somebody else's version of things. I've got 3 electrical contracts lined up for the spring already, word of mouth mostly, folks out here who remember my father's work before mine. I've got a young man from town, 19 years old, coming by twice a week wanting to learn the trade, and teaching him reminds me some of who I was before I let myself get small. I've got tomatoes coming up in a garden bed I built with my own 2 hands behind this cabin. Nobody admires them but me, and somehow that suits me just fine these days. I sit out on this dock most evenings now with a cup of coffee, and there's a particular kind of peace that comes with having nothing left to prove to a single living soul. I'm 63 years old, and I don't believe I've ever been more certain of exactly who I am. Before I let you go tonight, I want to ask you something, and I mean this. If you believe I was right to walk out that door without another word, without giving her the satisfaction of a fight, tell me so in the comments. If you think I should have stood up right there in that banquet hall and said my piece in front of every last one of them, tell me that instead. And if you think I waited too long, that the signs were there a full year before that dinner and I should have trusted my own gut sooner, I want to hear that too. I genuinely want to know where you land on it. And tell me where you're watching this from tonight, friend. What town, what state, what time it is on your end right now, because every single place you tell me means something to me. Sitting out here, Have you ever loved somebody so long and so completely that you stopped keeping track of whether it was being returned, and then woke up one morning unable to remember the last time anybody asked how you were really doing? If any part of what I've told you tonight lives somewhere in something you're quietly carrying, I want you to know you are not invisible. Not to me, not tonight. Leave me a word down in the comments, even just one, so I know you heard me. If this reached something in you tonight, go on and subscribe. There's more of these coming, true stories, the kind that are hard to sit with sometimes, but they always end up somewhere worth arriving at. This is a work of fiction inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined for this story. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.